Hi there, it's Marcus here, Friday afternoon. I had this lecture prepared yesterday, but then I got swept away in a whole tsunami of interactions with people overseas and so on. So I'm going to record it now, and I'm going to play a little game. I haven't really returned to the PowerPoint I constructed, though I felt satisfied with it yesterday. And I'm going to wing it, as they say, just to see what emerges in terms of the connections that my brain makes when I've had 24 hours between creating the lecture PowerPoint and giving the actual mini lecture, snapshot, thought bubble, whatever we want to call it. All right, so I'm going to share screen and pull that one up, and I'm going to hit that. So yeah, I'm really interested in this, in your take on this fantastic. Look how thick that is. These guys are amazing. David Graeber and David Wengrow. It came out last year. A little bit of background info. You know, I've got another book of David Graeber here, The Utopia of Rules. And it's an amazing, really, really great book. And I've got to get his, he did a history of debt, the first 5,000 years. Graeber's a very interesting character. He's also a COVID casualty. He died at the very end of 2020. He was on holiday somewhere. He'd got COVID. He'd gone off with his wife on holiday. He was only 59, and suddenly he collapsed in Italy somewhere. He was in northern Italy, and he died. And it turns out that COVID had really weakened his heart. Yeah, it's a real shame that we're not going to hear from him anymore. But an incredibly original thinker. And as I say, I remember this in one of the slides, I point out that particularly him, I can't really speak too much for David Wengrow, but David Graeber is a world-renowned anarchist as well. And to be an anarchist doesn't mean to run around creating chaos everywhere. It means that you're deeply suspicious of authority and the given narratives on the world and the way it works. And anarchists believe in the best of human beings. In other words, that we can self-organize, that we don't have to kill and have war. And also they don't believe in hierarchies. And I think, as certainly bearing that in mind, as I revisited the chapter for the reading that I set for you guys, you know, it's just anarchy is written, or anarchism, the philosophy of anarchy is written all over their suspicion of dominant narratives, and also their attention to individuals and the questioning about, well, what happened during all those thousands of years when nothing, we're told, happened? Well, you know, and I can think of some of the quotes I used to use years ago in this course from people like Wright, what's his name? A Brief History of Progress, Ronald Wright. You know, these guys were saying, look, the first 90,000 years of human history, nothing happened type thing. We just sort of made stone tools and nothing seemed to happen. And the other thing I want to point out about that particular reading, and it's going to take me a while to get there, it's about halfway through the lecture, is that their language is so tentative. It might be like this, or it seems hard to believe that, you know. So it's very much they're wearing their thinking on their sleeve type thing. They're not saying categorically this, that, or the other. But you know, they certainly, and this is where David Wengrow, who was an anthropologist, archaeologist type guy, comes in very much. They're very, you know, good on the evidence and saying, given all this, don't you think that it's a bit suspicious that they said nothing much is happening when you've got monumental building in Turkey and Anatolia, you've got, you know, princely burials in Siberia and so on? Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting stuff happening, you could almost say, in the subtext. That means hidden within their writing. Their writing is great. It's easy to read. Well, I hope you found so. But, you know, it's also deeply informed and it's deeply skeptical, which I think is really, really great. Anyway, let's launch into the lecture proper. All right, so off we go. So I want to sort of, as I tend to do, I like to look back and say, well, where have we been? And of course, the first week we started off looking at David Christian's work on big history, which describes the emergence of culture and therefore history. Remember that I link culture and history. Possibly I should have done a capital C there or a lowercase h, I'm not sure. But, that we can't separate culture from history. History, though, is not the disciplinary form of history, but history as in the past accumulation of experiences of humanity, okay? And, big history takes an evolutionary perspective. That means David Christian draws on energy, complexity, and collective learning to say, hey, if you look at Eric Chasson's work, we can see that the material universe has emerged through stages, crossing thresholds of complexity. And that when it hit the stage of not just life, but of social life, in other words, culture, that we also end up with collective learning, which folds back into the energy and complexity dimensions. And that sort of lays the groundwork for the next few readings for the course. Some aspects of the past and the present make a lot of sense when seen from this angle. Notice I'm being tentative now, I'm saying some aspects. However, other aspects of the historical are overlooked, okay? So some of what happens over the next few weeks after that very first week reading is that we start getting thinkers like Harari with Sapiens, I'm looking at the book there, and the McNeils, that book there, who are offering different perspectives on this evolutionary journey. So for Harari, we'll jump to him now, working with Harari, Imagined Orders, he offers us, collective learning writ large, which he talks about as imagined orders. And my points are that he helps us understand history, culture, and even the human condition as a shared expression of the human mind. That means, and our minds are social. The collective learning is one of the most unique aspects of the way human activity is organized, structured, directed, mobilized, all these things. People don't just go and build the pyramids, which is Harari's point. The pyramids are built because there is an organizing idea behind that, an imagined order. This is the relationship of us as human beings to this universe that we sit within that we really don't understand. But, we come up with belief systems like religion, but even, not just religion, political systems, economic systems. And that's where David Graeber comes in with his utopia of rules and his history of debt and so on. So we end up with creating these edifices of thought, like thought towers, mind palaces, whatever we want to call them, that are imagined orders. This is the way we think. In other words, the way we explain the world around us. And once we've explained it, you need to go through, we'll give you an example. We can see then the logical result. We believe in education. Education has been presented to us in an industrial model, a bit like schools, a bit like factories. Human bodies, that's what we can call children. Human bodies are domesticated, controlled, conditioned to behave in certain ways. They are organized according to categories of ability and so on, and they come out the other end. And according to where they've fallen in that whole process, and of course there are a whole bunch of surrounding elements to that process to do with literacy levels at home, the kind of culture you're sitting within and so on. You can get certain kinds of jobs. Some people might be street cleaners, other people might be lawyers or priests or whatever. So, that conditioning is part of what Imagined Orders does. All right, and we can see that spatially there are conditionings, the way cities are organized, the way ancient cities are organized, and so on. So Harari argues that we create meaning in the world to hold it together, to give it a sense of coherence, when otherwise it would appear to us totally random. From my perspective, his approach complements David Christian in some ways, but what it's important to recognize is that the imagined orders are not necessary orders. Now, here I'm playing philosophy. A necessary condition is something that is required to happen before something else can happen, and that's in a philosophical context. But imagined orders are not necessary orders. In other words, and this is where these two Davids, Graeber and Wengrow, come in. They argue that, hang on a second, there's no necessary sequence of historical unfolding. Complexity, we don't necessarily go from complexity to complexity. We can fall back into earlier, lower, inverted commas, what we might call less complex levels. That's probably better. Rather than low, just say less complex levels. They can take many forms, and that's what the Graeber and Wengrow argue, that they can take many forms. In this way, Harari bridges the approach of Christian with that of Graeber and Wengrow, which is our week 4 reading. All right. Along come the McNeils in week 3. That's this current week, though this lecture is for week 4. This snapshot is for week 4. McNeil's father and son team, they think, following that culture, they're thinking about human culture. Okay, it's hard not to marvel at how humanity spread so quickly over the entire planet. Quick, of course, is a relative word. Quick in terms of geological and life timelines. That means the timeline of life on this planet, 3.89 billion years, which stretch out over billions of years. It's quick in those terms. Many human lives have occurred. So McNeil's argue that it was human trade and the desire for stuff that drove human history. And stuff, of course, ultimately equates to energy. The more we get increasing levels of complexity. The more collective learning occurs and so on, the more we connect, there's more collective learning. So, for them, the model of the Silk Road is probably the best model. But if we look at the impact of the so-called discovery of the Americas or the New World on the Old World, the flow of ideas and materials between the two. I used to spend a lot of time talking about the Columbian Exchange or the Alexandrian Exchange and so on, which we don't get to look at in any great detail in this particular iteration of the course. But the Columbian Exchange is what transferred between Europe, Asia, Africa, the Old World, and the New World. So we took across to the Americas slaves. We took ideas of a white economics. We took greed and so on, lust for gold and silver and so on. We took Christianity. And what do we get from them? Well, we got tomatoes and potatoes and chilies and all those yummy things, a whole bunch of other foodstuffs as well, which you can't think of, Asian cultures, particularly India, for instance, with its curries. You can't think of them without chili, for instance. But, one of the things I really enjoyed about the Graeber and Wengrow book is that before, in the chapter prior to the one you read, they talk about Konderok, who's a North American indigenous philosopher of the 17th century. And they spent a lot of time. Stop it. My phone is ringing. Shush. Remind me later. All right. Stop. Good. Sorry about that. I can't turn it off because I'm actually hotspotting off this off my phone to do this. All right. So yeah, so it's left me a message too. I'll just flip that up. That can at least stop that from again. So this is in real time. How cool is that? So the McNeils think about culture. It is hard not to marvel at how quickly we spread across the planet. Quick, of course, is a relative word. And, they argue that this is the McNeils. They argue that human trade and the desire for stuff drove human history. So, where do we go from there? Well, I was just talking about the Columbian Exchange when the phone rang. If you're interested in the Columbian Exchange, just go and look it up on Wikipedia or wherever you like. And then we come to this current reading. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about the conversations. And really, I haven't talked about them in any deep way at all with you guys. But, I'm about next week, I'll be recording conversation number 9. I hope that you are listening to these conversations to hear what these individuals are saying. Livia, wonderful young woman living currently in Rome, but she'll be off to Canada to start a PhD soon. She's the coordinator for the Schumacher Education or Schumacher College, all of which you can find online. The Schumacher College you can find online. Livia is a bit harder to find, but you'll find her on LinkedIn. She also has a Twitter account and so on. But when I asked her about, well, what does it mean to be a global citizen? Remembering that she's Italian, lived in England for well over a decade, moved back to Canada, has worked with the Schumacher group in Ecuador and is off to Canada. So she's kind of, a great example of a global citizen at some level. But she talked about this feeling at a deep level that one's connected to the local and also to the planet. In other words, there's this layered thing there. Okay, we can't cut ties with anything on the planet is one of her key messages. And this is a message that, the Ecuadorian chief and shaman that she works with also promotes, that from an indigenous South American Ecuadorian perspective, that the forest is a living thing. The forest is made up of trees, which are living, and soil, which is living, and rocks, which are living. The water is living. So from that holistic perspective, we have to start thinking or rethinking global citizenship. Last week 2, you got the interview that I did with Sue Hetherington. She's a wonderful woman living in the UK, had an amazing, quite a stellar career. And, a few years ago, she knocked out this little book called The Quiet Disruptors, which I've got over here somewhere. I won't worry about going to find it. I can see it there buried. If I pull it out, all my other pile of books would fall down. But so talks about being local, but sensing our place in the world, okay? So she sees things in layers, being aware of multiple connections, very similar, but expressed quite differently to Livia, okay? This week, you will have listened to Dr. Jose Ramos, who's a friend of mine from quite a long time. I went down, it was lucky before I got COVID. I went and interviewed him in Little Woodend, which is near Hanging Rock, if you've ever heard of Picnic at Hanging Rock. It's very close, like 15 kilometres or 10 kilometres from Hanging Rock. And I caught up with Jose on a cold morning, and we went and found a cafe. And I wanted to talk to Jose because he's born in Mexico. No, he might have been born in LA, but his family are Mexican. Certainly his parents are born in Mexico, and he's now living in rural Victoria. And how did he get there and all the rest? But Jose is a very interesting scholar. Basically, his focus has been on the commons, the global commons, you might call it, which is a socioeconomic concept, you could say. He produced this great book on cosmolocalism, which you can download for free from that link there. Okay, he argues for a planetary commons where the global citizen, again, has a local, their feet on the ground somewhere, but they are committed to shaping positive outcomes for the world. And, he gave some examples, the first 2 of which were WikiHouse and FarmHack. The indented bullet points here, Schumacher, Quiet Disruptors, and WikiHouse, they are all offshoots of the second question that I asked, which is basically about can you give us an example in the world of something that gives you hope? There's something that demonstrates that we are not just lemmings going to walk off a cliff, though a bunch of us might walk off that cliff, or we might get dragged off the cliff just in the slipstream of some of the disasters that might face humanity and the planet in the next 50 to 100 years. And when I say disasters, I should say disasters in inverted commas, because really it's just the planet doing its thing in response to it. So this is what, when I often generally think in systems theories, and one of the aspects of a system theory is that you have drivers like human greed or human folly, human stupidity, but human aspiration, the best of us. But you also have feedback loops like climate change is a great example. The fires, the floods, the droughts, and so on are all feedback loops. And, even the reactions in politics of deep conservatism, Trumpism of some kind or other, denialism, conspiracy theories linked also to, higher, more, preachy sort of scientists saying that the world is screwed and we're all going to hell in a basket or a handbag or whatever the terms might be. We've got all of those elements. And we've got politicians worried about economics or about the 3-year, 4-year voting cycle. We've got all those things. Each one generates a certain flow that feeds back. So next week, you're going to be hearing from Amanda Reeves, who's a colleague from Melbourne. And she runs her own business, and I really like that she's running a business. Livy's off to do a PhD. Sue has managed, she's been the CEO of major institutional processes, and Jose, he basically runs his own business too. He's a consultant. So yeah, I want to encourage you to keep listening to the conversations, talk about them in your workshops, and just take one or two threads from the conversation that speak to you. All right, but that's really the whole idea of these conversations. I want to touch on complexity before I leap into the material directly related to this week, though there's nothing that's indirectly related to it in a sense this week 4. All those thinkers that we've looked at so far are seeing systems within systems. They're all seeing nested and relational spaces where energy, complexity, and collective learning, whether it's imagined orders, they're all systems, and they're all responding to various forms of feedback. A system, I want to tell you, is a coherent whole when working with other systems, or often working with other systems. So you might have the hydrosphere, the geosphere, the biosphere, the technosphere, and so on, okay? Remember that our planet is a coherent system from the cosmological perspective. It's called our planet sits within the solar system, and the planetary system is, it's a very special system because, of course, we have atmosphere, whereas the other planets have very little atmosphere or highly toxic atmospheres. And that atmosphere is just in that sweet spot, what we would call the Goldilocks spot, where the conditions are just right for life. Systems thinking involves thinking about without borders. Ecology may see systems nested in one another. So ecology is to do with the world and the living world, but it's to do with the relationships, particularly of biomes, for instance. So a pond sits near a tree, the tree's roots and the leaves do such and such. The tree is a coherent system. It's interesting with Australian trees, they can play host to up to 360 odd species, whereas an imported non-Australian tree, a non-native tree like camphor laurel or the slash pines, they can sustain only 50, 60 species. Okay, that they are, but in their own environments, they can sustain much more. Why? Because ecological systems are unique to space and place. Got to remember that. The key point for me is that systems are relational, and that a global citizen is growing into an awareness of this relational, in other words. And of course, I don't think, there's any perfect or ideal model for a global citizen. It's one of the reasons why I'm asking all these people in the conversations, what do you think a global citizen is, I really like Nora Bateson. She wrote this book, Small Arcs of Larger Circles. Okay, Nora, has... She makes many interesting observations, and she writes beautifully. And she says, I suppose it takes time to be able to respond to an acute situation with love. So no one as yet has mentioned love, and this is true for all of my interviews with in terms of their definition of a global citizen. But, there's a love that stems from complexity, or she turns it around, complexity that stems from love. But love is about, in her mind, is about the relational. Okay, and that it's a deep appreciation of the relationality of the human context. There is no such thing as human without the non-human. for instance. So lastly, before we do start on the graver stuff, I'll touch on the historical literacy at last, and I apologize for all the slow messing around there and the mismessaging. Also, I went through the modules yesterday going, oh my God, look at that, that's there and that's not supposed to be there and all that sort of stuff. So I'm trying to straighten some of that up. Partly that's due to my COVID brain or post-COVID brain, but also it's due to the fact that the library took ages to get the icons of the Stone Age, which is now available, as you hopefully know. Then I've scanned and sent the library, and we got through copyright as well, Mighty Megaliths and the Epics of Gilgamesh. And this week, that means week 4, we're off to Altamera, which is this beautiful cave here that is shown in the image. Altamera was discovered as sometime, I think about the 1860s or 70s. I should have gone and checked that date, shouldn't I? By a chap who had been to Paris, he was a Spanish guy, who'd been to Paris, went to this exhibition where there was some stuff on Stone Age art and tools and stuff. It was very, very exciting time for Europeans discovering that they actually had a Stone Age. Okay, and he went back and he was thinking, you know, I've got a cave in our backyard type thing. He was obviously very wealthy aristocrat of some kind. So he went off and was looking through this cave, and he was in there day after day over quite a few weeks, trying to digging around and seeing what he could find. Couldn't find anything. His little daughter went with him one time after begging him and harassing him, and he kept saying no. But she went, and there he was scrounging around on the ground. She said, "Dad, look up." And above them were all these amazing bison and other animals that date back, I think it's about 26,000 years. So, you know, I'm giving you these snapshots because I want to give you some benchmarks. Now, admittedly, these are all sort of quasi-European. The icon, the megaliths, and Altamera are all sort of from the prehistory of that sort of the European area. Particularly Gilgamesh is more is broader, but you know, Gilgamesh is part of that Semitic tradition that informed the Old Testament, for instance. The Gilgamesh is, you know, is about a period where literacy was emerging. It's a period of great organizing myths as well. Gilgamesh gets mentioned by Harari, also gets mentioned by the Graver and Graver, not in your reading, I don't think. He gets mentioned by James Scott here. This is a book that I'm going to refer to in this lecture a little bit further on. And I've added that as a sort of an extra reading for this week 4, one chapter from there. But, you know, the point is that you can't think historically without having pegs in your head that says, okay, the icons of the Stone Age, you know, these various, this female cult that seemed to spread across the Eurasia, from one end of Eurasia almost to the other. Very similar little statuettes have been discovered. Their similarities suggest that this cult was widespread. The use of megaliths by Neolithic peoples, particularly to shape their landscape, is very, very important, or to mark their landscape. They only appear to have emerged as sedentary life emerged, so agricultural life. They suggest, the megaliths suggest to Graver and Wengrove, that there was an organizing principle in society that suggests that there were different forms of hierarchies being practiced already, and so on. If you don't know about Gilgamesh, I would say, simply because that's where we get our Noah story from, you know, thousands of years before it was recorded in the Bible. And so on. But Gilgamesh also speaks to a period of, you know, emergent hierarchies and, you know, the God man, because Gilgamesh is 2/3 God and 1/3 human being, so to speak. Just like a lot of the heroes from other later mythic periods, you know, just thinking in terms of Heracles, or Hercules, as he's often called in using his Roman name. You know, many of these individuals from mythology are credited with having, you know, at least one god and one human. Usually it's Zeus getting up to mischief with some young girl, and we end up with a Theseus or a Perseus or like that. All right. So I want to sort of continue. I will continue. We've got 9 of these readings available now, up to week 9. I've got to go and next time I get into uni, I've got to go and scan the last 3. I'll attempt to make them more contemporaneous and less Eurocentric as we go along. So please go and have a look at those readings if you haven't done so. They're really enjoyable. They're all, relatively speaking, they're short because, you know, they are taken from National Geographic magazines. All right. So onwards, let's keep going. Oh, look at this. At last, we get to Graeber and Wengrow. Seeing the world with fresh eyes is what they're trying to do. So in week 4, we look at this reading, okay? These guys are suspicious, as I've already said, you know, they're skeptical of the big picture. And they are also question how we as scholars read evidence. They're giving us a bunch of evidence, but saying such and such has looked at it this way, such and such has looked at it this way, but how about this? Or why didn't they take it to that point, and so on? It's a very interesting, I think, and one of the reasons why I chose it is because it teaches us how to think, or it models how to think, how to question the evidence that comes before us. I already pointed out in the introduction that they bring an anarchist perspective, which privileges the intimate and the personal, the local and the unique, okay? And then I give you a definition pretty much straight from, I don't know, from the internet somewhere, that anarchy is not simply chaos, though it is associated with that state. Rather, anarchy is the absence of controlling forces, such as government, and a belief in the freedom. So it's the absence of government, but it's also a belief. So there probably should be a comma in there or something, a belief in the freedom of the individual, that the individual should be making their choices. And therefore, because individuals do think and do act on their own, in their own self-interest, but also in their interests of the communities, their values are shaped by culture and so on. And because we have a couple of 100,000 years at least of human sociality demonstrated in the historical record, the archaeological record and so on, they're saying, look, the fact that you want to, you being the scholars of, you know, human, the prehistory, want to tell us that all human beings were hunter-gatherers before they became farmers. No, we just can't accept that. That all human beings were egalitarian, freewheeling, small groups before that. No, and there's a lot of evidence for it. Other ways of reading that. So that's what their reading is all about. So I like it because they bring a healthy skepticism to what we're doing. They also state on a page before we start this reading, so this reading starts on page 78, I believe, so this one's page 77, they say, we need to approach the evidence of the human past with fresh eyes. And then they throw a rock at one of my favorite subjects, which is sociology. One of the most pernicious aspects of standard world historical narratives is precisely that they dry everything up. They reduce people to cardboard stereotypes, simplify the issues. Are we inherently violent, selfish and violent, or innately kind and cooperative? They do this in ways that themselves undermine the possibility or even destroy it, they reckon, of our sense of human potential or possibility. So for them, they're saying, look, and they would say this of David Christian stuff, energy, complexity, and collective lean. Where are the people in all of this? People have been reduced to cardboard cutouts. We're oversimplifying things. And, you know, so and then they say, and the result of this oversimplification is that, you know, we feel, oh, you know, complexity, energy, and collective learning. Okay, I can't do anything much from my perspective, from my little world, so I might as well just give up. So that's a question of agency, which is the ability, as I say here, to act, for us to act, to do, to achieve goals, even goals that are contrary to the dominant worldviews we inhabit. And that's what they're on about here. They're saying, hang on a second, those worldviews aren't necessarily in alignment with the evidence as they give us the, as they present it in their chapter, in their reading. I think it's really, really fun to have thinkers who are not afraid to question the dominant or conventional narrative. So, where do we go? So in that same reading, and so how should we, now let's be clear about this, they say. Just going to check on the order of this. So this is all off the same page. I thought that was right. This is all page 21, which is not part of your reading. So you're getting an extra slice of Graeber and Wengrow. Okay. So now we should be clear here. Social theory always, of necessity, they would say, involves a bit of simplification. I think they should have underlined a bit, because I think they reckon that it goes way too far. Social theory is largely a game of make-believe. Shh, don't tell the sociology people this. In which we pretend, just for the sake of argument, that there is just one thing going on here. Essentially, we reduce everything to a cartoon so as to be able to detect patterns that could be otherwise, or would be otherwise, invisible. So the problem comes long after this that we've discovered something, that we continue to keep that simplification in some sort of rock hard fashion. Now, I have to say they're not being fair to social theory, but at the same time, these guys work, or Graeber worked, past tense, in universities. They know how people can be hardcore. It's feminism, or it's structural functionalism, or it's whatever it is. And that's the way, all right? Personally, I like to draw on social theory when it helps me see something. I don't have to feel an allegiance. I know that overall, if you were to classify my approach to the thinking world and to social order, I would be called a critical and transformational theorist. All right. And that's because I'm interested in relationships of power, how power enables, disables. But I personally am also interested in what can we do to see it differently, which is one of the reasons why, of course, I like this Graeber and Wengrow reading. But, you know, it's, to me, we need to see that social theory helps us see patterns, helps us stand back. You know, until I came across the David Christian work, I had a feeling that something was going on there that I wasn't putting my finger on. But until he gave me those three categories of energy, complexity, and collective learning, I was fumbling around, trying to articulate something about social change and social evolution, which constantly felt slightly out of focus because I didn't have those concepts. But if I were to become a card-carrying energy, complexity, and collective learning person, and, you know, totally devote myself to one form of history, which they call big history, personally, I would feel stifled, okay? I need everything from the lovely little stories that National Geographic gives us through to social, feminist, ecological, environmental. I need a whole range of historical lenses to approach the various issues that we face when we look at the past. So this is where James Scott comes in. That's the other book that I was waving around here, Against the Grain. Okay, what's the subtitle? A Deep History of the Earliest States. Now, Scott, I've been reading Scott since the 1990s. He's been around a long time, writing really interesting stuff. So he makes this point: long before what many would consider proper culture, Homo sapiens had been deliberately rearranging the biotic world around itself, with consequences both intended and unintended. This is a famous image of Aboriginal Australians, Indigenous Australians, using fire stick farming and so on to manage their environment. It's been used by Bill Gamage, whose book is somewhere around here, on The Great Estate, and it's one of those images that Gamage uses to illustrate the fact that the Indigenous were managing the Australian environments in such a way that they shaped the environment shaped them, but that they were able to live a sustainable life long over many millennia through many changes, ups and downs. So this is to me, it's an important image. But, the point that he's making here is that we human beings have been doing this rearranging, terraforming, you might call it, of the biotic world. That means of the living world. He also points out in this reading here that it's not just human beings that have done this. ants and termites, beavers, and so on, have all done it too. That one of the things that life forms do, not just mammals and insects, but also trees and so on, they each species works to enhance the survival, the life chances of its species, okay? And that work often involves collaboration with other species and life forms and so on. So, he's questioning conventional wisdom, and he does throughout his book about domestication, for instance. Just drag this over here. So he says on domestication, he makes the following point: we as a species are inclined to see ourselves as the actor, the agent. Remember, I talked about agency a few slides back in narratives of domestication. We domesticated wheat, rice, sheep, pigs, goats. But if we squint at the matter from a slightly different angle, here he's doing exactly what the Graeber and Wengrow like to do, slightly different. We could argue that it was we who were domesticated. Looked at from this angle, who is doing whose bidding amongst almost this becomes almost a problem of metaphysics, which is a branch of philosophy that studies the fundamental nature of reality. How does reality work? Oh, human beings are meant to be on the top. It says so in the Old Testament, and so on. But that sort of mythic sense of we are at the top gets undermined when we start saying, hang on a second, it's my son outside chopping some wood, bang, bang, bang. The point he's trying to make or making is that when we clear a field and keep all the bad insects away so that wheat or rice or whatever the grain is or potatoes or whatever the vegetable might be is, that we are actually supporting that species. We have made a deal with that species. I'll look after your environment, make sure nothing bad comes and gets you, and I will take a large amount of what you produce at the end as payment or reward. I think that's a really interesting idea, particularly the way that it challenges the story that we domesticated wheat, rice, sheep, pigs, goats, and so on. It could easily could be said that it was the other way around. Ultimately, I think we collaborated with these species to create energy resources, whether it's grain in a silo or bags of potatoes, that help us through periods when those food sources are not generally available. Okay, so it's kind of like which came first, the chicken or the egg? All right. Going back to Graeber and Graeber, because really bad reading and not James Scott. Scott just adds something really interesting to the reading. They make the following point. People of the deep or even the recent past can be caught in what these guys call an evolutionary straitjacket. So again, here they are saying, but everybody becomes faceless if we just do energy complexity and collective learning. He says that the people's place in history is defined by their mode of subsistence. You're a farmer, you're a potter, you're a baker, all right? And their role blindly is to enact some abstract law of development, which we understand, but they don't. So, they are really challenging a fundamental principle of this course, that we can see, if you stand back far enough, we can see that there is an evolutionary trajectory. That doesn't mean it's getting better or more advanced or sophisticated. It just means that we can see that we move from one level of complexity to the next, slowly but surely. Slowly might be over millennia, and that in that period there are often collapses that take us back, not just generations, but back millennia or millions of years even, before we reach a similar level again. I like to say, yes, I think there's an evolutionary trajectory. And I like to also say, but hang on a second, for any of us in this process, it's not evolutionary in some meta sense of how great is the world and how is it changing, but it's also that I grow personally through this. With my collective learning, I share my thinking with you guys, for instance. he's just talking a lot of rubbish. Others will be thinking, oh, he told me something that will help me pass. And some of you might take this thinking and actually apply it to your own life. I'm not skeptical or a cynic. I'm just a realist. I know that people come to courses for different reasons. And our interactions with people are often transactional. Why? Because maybe that's the core principle of relationship. But beyond that, we live in a transactional world. This is a capitalist modernist world. I give you something that you need, you supply me something that demonstrates that you have mastered this idea. I pass you and you just move on. And in 5 years' time, you've forgotten all about HIS140 and, this eccentric teacher that you had. Doesn't matter. Doesn't worry me in the least. So almost at the end now. So long live oddballs. I think we all need oddballs. There is every reason, Graeber and Wengrow comment, there's every reason to believe that skeptics and nonconformists exist in every human society. What varies is how we deal with them, how others react. Do we burn them at the stake? Radin, who's a guy that they had just referred to in the previous paragraph, who wrote a book in 1927 on, the consequences of human thinking. Radin was interested in the intellectual consequences, the kind of speculative systems of thought, such as out-of-sync characters might create. There are also political implications, he notes, or they note. It is often people who are just slightly odd who become leaders. Yes, people like Trump, for instance. The truly odd can become spiritual figures. Oh, the Pope or Mahatma Gandhi or, whoever it might be. But even more, they can and often do serve as a kind of, I knew that I left the O off there, and I forgot to go back and put it in, as a kind of reserve of potential talent and insight. So I like that oddballs can also act as a kind of reserve of potential talent and insight that can be called upon in times of crisis and unprecedented turns of affairs. So to end, stop it. Stop it. Someone intangible. All right. So, sorry about that. One final thought. I actually go back to Nora Bateson. Why? Because she sings my song, you might say. She points out that context matters, and she says evolution is in the context, in what we learn together, mutually. And I think that's what the Global Citizens Conversations are all about. Each of these readings, in their own way, speaks to that context. Graeber and Graeber speak to a more local, diverse context. The other three are kind of standing back and giving us a broader picture. I don't think one delegitimates the other. I think they all support one another in different ways. You might be looking at this image that I've got here. This is a kind of interesting take on the sages and the elephant, or the blind men and the elephant, which is an old Islamic parable. Then it slipped into Hinduism and a whole range of others, but I'm pretty sure it starts out with Islamic wisdom, where somebody said, and they told the story hundreds of years ago, that if there were 10 blind men or whatever it might be, or sages. Now let's stay with the blind men. Well, there are 10 blind men, and they were presented with an elephant, and they were asked to describe it. So one felt the ear and said, oh, it's like a palm leaf. One felt the tail and said it's like a piece of rope or a snake. Or one felt the trunk and it was a snake, like that. There's another version is that there are 10 wise men locked in a room. They're looking through a crack or a pinhole. Elephant walks past, each sees a different part of the animal and thinks that's what an elephant is. So this is what this image is all about, ultimately, is that context matters. Context will define so much of how we see the world. I'm trying to get rid of that. Good. So, yeah, I'm hoping that now, this is the 4th week, that you're getting a sense of where we're going with this course. It's a thinking course. It's about social change. It's about the big picture, without forgetting what David Graeber and David Wengrow are talking about, which is that there's so much diversity in the human past that we can't ignore it or just brush it aside and say everything's about energy, complexity, and collective learning. No, it's not. It's about the emergence of, the global condition today with a deep attention to the past and its historical roots. But thank you very much for all of that. I'm going to stop share and I will say goodbye, and I'll talk to you next week. Hope you have a good week of thinking and engagement with really stimulating ideas. And I hope you enjoy the readings too. Bye-bye.